The first thing Pat Garrett's own deputy said after the shots were fired was, "Pat, you have shot the wrong man." That's not a conspiracy theory. That's John Poe's own words, written in his memoir and published in 1933. He was standing just outside Pete Maxwell's bedroom door on the night of July 14, 1881. He didn't see the shooting. He heard 2 shots in the dark, and his first instinct, before a candle was lit, before anyone examined anything, was that Garrett had killed an innocent person. Maxwell eventually brought a tallow candle. They went in. Garrett and Poe and his other deputy, Kip McKinney, crouched over a body on the floor by candlelight in a room surrounded entirely by Billy's Fort Sumner friends, the same people who had been sheltering him for months. Under those conditions, with Garrett holding a $500 bounty worth roughly $15,000 in today's money, they concluded it was Billy the Kid. The body was buried within approximately 15 hours of the shooting. No doctor was ever present. No post-mortem photograph was ever taken, and here's why that matters. After John Wesley Hardin was killed in 1895, someone photographed the body. After Jesse James was killed in 1882, someone photographed the body. After the Dalton gang was shot down in Coffeyville in 1892, someone photographed the bodies. Post-mortem photography of notorious outlaws was standard practice. Billy the Kid, the most famous outlaw of the era, was never photographed after death. The inquest the next morning was run by a justice of the peace, not a coroner. The county coroner was 120 miles away in Las Vegas, New Mexico, with no telegraph and no railroad connecting him to Fort Sumner. The 6-man jury was composed entirely of Billy's Fort Sumner neighbors. Their verdict, justifiable homicide. And here's what almost nobody talks about. That report was never formally entered into San Miguel County's official records. The justice of the peace who presided never recorded it in his own official books. The document was found later in Garrett's personal files when he needed it to claim the reward. Pete Maxwell, the only other person who was in the room when the shooting happened, never gave a public statement about that night. Not once. For the rest of his life, he refused to discuss it. I'm not building a conspiracy here. This is a straightforward forensic inventory of what the chain of evidence from July 14, 1881 actually looks like. By modern standards, it fails on multiple counts. And the method that could resolve it has existed for 30 years. So let's talk about that method, and then let's talk about why it hasn't been used. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child unchanged through the maternal line. Every child a woman has carries the same mitochondrial DNA she does. It doesn't recombine the way nuclear DNA does, and it survives in bone for a very long time. Forensic labs have extracted viable mtDNA from skeletal remains over 1,000 years old. In 1994, British and Russian scientists used mtDNA to identify 9 skeletal remains found in a shallow grave near Yekaterinburg, Russia. The bodies had been buried since 1918. The study was published in Nature Genetics by Gil, Ivanov, and colleagues. It identified the Romanov royal family. A year later, in July 1995, researchers exhumed remains from Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, Nebraska, believed to be those of Jesse James. They extracted mtDNA from 2 teeth and from hair samples recovered from the original burial site on the James family farm. They compared it against blood samples from 2 maternal line descendants of Jesse's sister, Susan. The sequences matched. The full study came out in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2001 by Stone, Stone King, and Stars. I want to be direct about what that Jesse James study actually concluded, because it matters for what we're about to examine. The researchers wrote it themselves. Do the mtDNA results prove that the exhumed remains are those of Jesse James? The answer must be no. There is always a statistical possibility that the remains belong to a different person who shares the same maternal lineage. What the test gives you is strong evidentiary support, not certainty. In forensic terms, that is not nothing. It is dramatically better than a candlelit identification in a room full of people with a financial stake in the outcome. Now apply the same method to Billy the Kid. His mother was Catherine Antrim, born Catherine McCarty around 1829. She died of tuberculosis on September 16, 1874. Her obituary ran in the Mining Life newspaper. Catherine, wife of William Antrim, aged 45 years. She is buried in Memory Lane Cemetery in Silver City, New Mexico. The grave is documented and confirmed. Catherine Antrim rests there. Billy the Kid is supposedly buried in the old military cemetery at Fort Sumner. Here is the complication. The Pecos River flooded Fort Sumner in 1889 and again severely in 1904. Both times the cemetery was swept. Headstones were washed away and remains were displaced. Afterward, different locals gave inconsistent accounts of where Billy's grave actually was. The headstone there today was not placed at the time of burial. Fort Sumner's history is tangled, so the DNA test has two questions. First, can the right grave be located? Second, if it can, does the remains share Catherine Antrim's maternal lineage? Yes means Billy is there. No means someone else is. The flood complication makes the test more complicated and more interesting. Because if the Fort Sumner grave produces no matching DNA, that itself is a forensic finding. DNA test could settle the mystery. The science is ready. Both graves are documented. The precedent exists. The cost runs in the thousands of dollars, not millions. Science shows it is feasible. So why hasn't it happened? Why remains unanswered? Fort Sumner, New Mexico had a population of 889 people in the 2020 census. It sits on the flat high plains of eastern New Mexico. Its primary tourist draw is a grave. The Billy the Kid Museum is on Highway 60. The gravesite brings in visitors from every state and from overseas. Every summer, the town holds the Billy the Kid pageant as part of Old Fort Days. The restaurants, the gift shops, the motel rooms, nearly all of it runs on one story. Baca County Sheriff Gary Graves understood the pressure he was up against when he told NBC News in December 2003 that Fort Sumner is very, very, very dependent upon our tourism base. Graves said that while arguing in favor of the DNA test, his frustration was that the mystery kept sending tourist dollars to Hicko, Texas, instead. The logic was straightforward. Confirm Billy is buried there, Fort Sumner wins the story outright. But the town's mayor at the time, Lopez, opposed the exhumation. His position: if anybody else wants to say they have Billy the Kid, that's fine. Let them prove it. Here is the forensic economics that nobody spells out plainly. If the DNA confirms Billy is in Fort Sumner, the unsolved mystery narrative disappears. The grave becomes settled history, not living legend. Some of the draw goes with it. If the DNA shows Billy is not in Fort Sumner, that the flood-churned cemetery holds someone else, or no one at all, then the most visited frontier grave in the American West has a problem. The town's entire claim collapses. Either result is worse for Fort Sumner than leaving it alone. The mystery, unresolved, keeps every option open. On June 7, 2003, Baca County Sheriff Gary Graves opened an official homicide investigation into the death of Billy the Kid. The case number was 03-06-136-01. He could recite that number by heart. He told True West magazine that when the investigation was finished, Pat Garrett would either have a black eye or a hero's bath. Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and his deputy, Steve Cedarwall, were running their own investigation in parallel. Both wanted the same thing, to exhume Catherine Antrim's grave in Silver City and the Fort Sumner graves. Governor Bill Richardson publicly backed it. He said, "We want to get to the bottom of it," when speaking to Voice of America. The mayors of both towns said no. Fort Sumner's mayor opposed disturbing the Fort Sumner Cemetery. Silver City's mayor opposed disturbing Catherine Antrim's grave. In New Mexico, 140-year-old outlaw remains fall into a genuine legal gray zone. Who has jurisdiction? Who bears liability? Who controls the results? Who pays? The petitions went to New Mexico's 6th District Court. Opposition was filed. The legal fight ran for years. Sullivan and Cedarwall eventually abandoned the Fort Sumner approach and went to Arizona. They organized an exhumation of John Miller, a Prescott man who had privately claimed before his death in 1937 to be Billy the Kid. A DNA expert and a forensic anthropologist were on site. And then Dr. Henry Lee came in. If you know forensic science, you know that name. Lee worked the O.J. Simpson case. He worked John Benet Ramsey. He worked Scott Peterson. Lee came to Fort Sumner ranch country and took samples from a 19th century carpenter's bench that had been discovered on a local ranch. The bench was believed to be the one Billy's body was laid out on after the shooting. It reportedly still had blood traces. Lee collected those samples. The results were never publicly disclosed. That is not a rumor. It is documented. When researchers and journalists started asking for the findings, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office stonewalled. Ongoing investigation, they said. Personal records. Done on their own time with private money. In 2007, a forensic psychiatrist named Gail Cooper, Harvard Medical School, Beverly Hills practice, who had moved to New Mexico specifically to research this case, filed suit under New Mexico's Inspection of Public Records Act. She wanted those DNA results. It took 5 years to get them. In April 2012, 133 pages of documents were finally produced. The court confirmed they had existed from the start and should have been released years earlier. But there was no conclusive DNA finding in those pages, because no definitive comparison test was ever run. The blood on that bench, whatever it was never matched against a confirmed sample from Catherine Antrim's line, because Silver City's mayor had blocked that exhumation. The lawsuit, combined with a newspaper settlement, cost Lincoln County more than $195,000 in documented legal fees. In 2014, a court found the former sheriff and 2 deputies had acted willfully, wantonly, and in bad faith in withholding the records. Some of the documents released had been altered before they were handed over. Then, in 2015, historian Robert Stahl petitioned a New Mexico District Court to issue a formal death certificate for William Bonney. As of 2026, New Mexico has still never issued one. The most famous outlaw in American history has no official legal death record in the state where he allegedly died. There's also a third dynamic here. In Hico, Texas, there is a Billy the Kid museum built around the claim that William Brushy Bill Roberts, who died in Hico on December 27, 1950, at age 90, according to his family, was the real Billy the Kid. Roberts came forward in 1948 through a paralegal named William Morrison, claiming he wanted the pardoned Governor Lew Wallace had promised Billy in 1879 and never delivered. 5 men who said they knew Billy personally identified Roberts as the same person. Museum accounts say that when investigators checked the scars on Roberts's body against Billy's documented wound locations, they matched. The case against the claim is simple and serious. Roberts's family Bible lists his birth year as 1879. That would make him roughly 1 year old when the only confirmed photograph of Billy the Kid was taken in late 1879 or early 1880. New Mexico officials rejected his pardon request in 1950. He died of a heart attack weeks later. Here is what a DNA test on the Fort Sumner grave would actually tell us about Brushy Bill. Not much directly. The test would tell us whether the Fort Sumner remains share Catherine Antrim's maternal line. It would not by itself confirm or deny whether Roberts was also Billy. That would require comparing Roberts's own remains, buried in Hamilton, Texas, to Catherine Antrim's line separately. But if the Fort Sumner grave matches Catherine Antrim, Billy died in 1881, and the Brushy Bill claim is permanently closed. Hiko's museum loses its premise. So the uncertainty that keeps that museum alive requires the main test to stay undone. That is where we are. Three separate interests, economic, legal, and institutional, have kept a proven forensic method from being applied to America's most famous unsolved outlaw death for over 20 years. The one piece of physical evidence that was actually collected, blood traces on a carpenter's bench, handled by one of the country's foremost forensic scientists, produced results that were suppressed for 5 years, released under court order, and contained no conclusive findings because the comparison sample was never authorized. And I keep coming back to that moment. John Poe standing outside that door, hearing 2 shots in the dark, saying, "You've shot the wrong man," before he saw a single thing. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was the law who was there. He changed his position after they looked at the body by candlelight. That's documented too. But that first instinct, the doubt before the reward money, before the book deal, before the legend, was real. 144 years later, the test that could answer it cost less than a used car. Case number 03-06-136-01 is still open. The authorization to run the test has never been signed, not because the science can't do it, because in Fort Sumner and in Lincoln County and in the legal archives of New Mexico, the mystery is worth more than the answer.